us, bro. Like your priorities in the right order, you know?
Yeah, most definitely. Nothing else matters, you know?
Yeah, that's definitely true, man.
All right, so we're connecting to Facebook Live right now. I just want to give y'all a so if anybody wants to share it on Facebook, it's on my my wall right now.
Okay.
Anybody wants to, and I'm gonna get back over here to Zoom. And nothing else matters, you know. Trying to get us back to Zoom. All right.
Got you, brother.
All right, admit. Okay. All right, we're almost ready. I have it's live on Facebook as well. So you all, if you need to share it, you can share it from there.
Okay. Yeah. What's up, baby? Hey, is it over? Yeah.
I see Brother Tim made it in. Good to see you, man. And Brother Charlie, Miss Ruby,
Hey, Kevion.
Brother Shaylin. Hey, Mr. Shane Newell. Good to see you.
Greg's in too, bro.
Yeah. I was just chopping up with him before you got in.
Oh, okay.
How you doing, brother Tim? Charlie, how y'all doing, man?
You doing? Good to see you.
Likewise, brother.
Right. All right. We'll give it another 3 minutes, and then we'll get started right away. I believe in starting on time. Mr. Combs has just joined us as well. Good to see you. Mr. White, good to see you, sir. And
good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to be seen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Charge this real quick. Let's get everybody to Charlie, I can't. It won't let me tag you. Okay, I can tag you now. So I can tag you that way. You can if you want to do, or you can just share it directly from my wall. The link. Charlie, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, bro.
All right, you wanted a link for Zoom? Or are you good?
Oh no, I'm in here. I'm in here now.
Okay. All right. Just making sure. All right. It is 6 o'clock, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. First of all, to our panelists, Mr. Combs, Mr. White, and Mr. Hollis, I want to say thank you just for agreeing to do this for us. We know, we recognize where we are as a nation concerning civil unrest and everything that's been going on. And because of the civil unrest, it started a dialogue between some of us and our local police chiefs. We met with Chief Reyes, we met with Chief Henson, Chief Reyes from Palm Springs Police, Chief Henson from Desert Hot Springs Police. I can't think of the chief in Indio. Can't think of his name off the top of my head. We met with him and the interim chief at Cathedral City Police Department. And we talked about things concerning to what we've seen on television, specifically Ahmaud Brooks and George Floyd. And in that, we've had this discussion for our entire lives in this valley. The perception, if it is a perception, or the reality of unfair treatment towards us with, when I say us, Black and brown, with law enforcement. Palm Springs Police have kind of come under fire with one of the city council members bringing it up and bringing it to light. And all four police chiefs we're pretty candid with this. Now, in asking the police chiefs to be more accountable to the community and be more accountable to us, to where we can find out what happens with those officers when they do commit these, well, we can call it what it is, crimes against people when they're pulled over and all that kind of stuff. They agree that they're going to do a little bit better in looking at their force policy, making sure body cams are enacted and things of that nature. But in talking to Charlie and Dieter and a couple of others, we said, okay, we have to do more for our community as well. And so we understand that improvement has to be on both sides. And so we started asking what were the things that we can do in order to ensure that we do all that we can to get home at night, to get back home after a traffic stop or after an encounter with law enforcement. So we brought you all to the table because you have experience either in the jails or on the street or in law enforcement as a whole. And we figured we want to hear from you. And this is going to be a pretty simple format. We have 5 questions that I believe that you all have been sent already. These questions came from our panel. And then at the end, towards the end of this hour, we'll field whatever questions get sent to us via chat or in Facebook or what have you. But the first 5 questions have been sent out to you. I'm going to ask the first one, and then Charlie's going to follow up with the next 2. And then we can start with... we'll go this way, 1, 2, 3, Mr. Combs, Mr. Hollis, and then Mr. White. And if we could just spend a couple minutes on each question, that way we can make sure we maximize our hour and get everything answered. All right.
Keefion, is there any way that you can possibly allow the gentleman to kind of speak a little bit?
Oh, sure.
About,
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Say who they are.
Yeah.
You know, introduce themselves.
Yeah, we'll do that. And just so you all know, this is being recorded as well. So you have we have Facebook Live right now where it can be shared, and then it's also being recorded on the cloud. So if anyone needs a copy of the recording, let me know at the end of this, and I'll make sure it gets emailed to you. So starting with Mr. Combs, would you mind, and then Mr. White and Mr. Hollis, would you mind introducing yourselves, please?
Hi, I'm Walter Combs. I'm a former police captain with the city of Palm Springs. I spent 28 years as a law enforcement officer here in the Valley. And prior to that, I was a United States Marine Corps member, and I did that for 8.5 years. And I'm currently an adjunct professor right here at College of the Desert here in Palm Desert.
Awesome. Who's next, Mr. White?
Yes. Hey, good evening. Hey, Tim White here. I'm actually a sergeant with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Been a law enforcement officer for about 20 years now, as it turns out. So I'm from the desert, from Palm Springs, born and raised. My parents still live out there in the community. As it turns out, I'm also the command chief of Air Force Reserve. So I'm on an extended military leave. I'm stationed out of the Pentagon in DC, and I'll be here until 2022 when I retire out and return back to the department. And thank you for leading this discussion, having us on, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Hollis.
Hey, good evening, folks. I'm Greg Hollis. I have 10 years with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department working corrections. Before then, 8 years in the military, and I recently received my nursing degree. I went back to school and got my degree so I can serve my community, in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, brothers. And Charlie, thank you for reminding me to do the introduction portion. I moved kind of quickly.
If we can let everyone know that when you come on, to place your phone on mute. Everyone needs to put their phone on mute.
I'm actually going to mute everybody. I'm going to mute everyone myself. Yeah. And then I'll mute everyone so we can just hear from the speaker at the time. And then that way we can make sure that we have clarity and everything. All right, so here's the first question, and I'm going to unmute. Y'all, I'm learning this this whole format. All right. The first question is going to go to Mr. Combs, and then we'll go to Mr. Hollis, then Mr. White in that formation. We discussed health and welfare checks for mental health for the officers. That was one of the first things that came up because a lot of times officers will have bad encounters, and PTSD is a real thing. And so my experience from being a chaplain with Desert Hot Springs Police and riding with officers, you saw that a lot of our police officers had some pretty bad encounters throughout the week. And we were wondering, we wanted to know, we found out from the police chiefs that mental health checks or psychiatric exams weren't necessarily mandatory unless there was kind of a shooting situation. So we wanted to know from your experiences, what did you all do to keep yourself mentally strong and mentally healthy throughout the course of your career? And what do you recommend officers who are currently wearing a badge, what do you recommend they do as well? Well, hold on, Mr. Combs. We can't hear you. Hold on just a minute.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. There you go. Okay, thank you.
That's a great question. And it's something that I learned early on in my career, because I wanted to have a long career, is how to prioritize my family time, my workout time, and my police time. So I was able to do that. And I learned early, as I mentioned, that was very important in terms of how I performed as a police officer, and how I performed as a father, as a husband, as just an ordinary person. That work-life balance was very, very important to me. We hear about police officers taking the job home with them. I made it a point that I never did that. I never took work home with me. And sometimes when you do that, you bottle that up inside. And I recognize that as well. And I looked for other activities to kind of take my mind away from that as well. In fact, back to your earlier point, I know in Palm Springs, and you mentioned that you talked to Chief Reyes, whenever there was a traumatic event, we made sure that the officers got counseling. But we took it a step further. We made sure that the dispatchers, anybody, community service officers, anybody that was working at night or around or had access to that information got the help that they needed. One of the things that we started when I was there is the chaplain program, and we felt that was really, really important to have that other side of the equation brought into fold at the police department. So those are the things that I did, and those are the things that I promoted, and with the help of with the chief and the city, to make sure that the officers had that assistance as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hollis.
Yeah, just based on my experience, some of the ways people cope is just by, it's talking about it is good, but to be honest with you, in law enforcement, that's kind of considered as a weakness. So, people kind of find different ways. Unfortunately, a lot of people hit the bottle, to be honest with you, man. To be totally honest. And, you just try to you just try to get through it, man. Law enforcement, it's a tough job because you're asking people to go and put out fires, essentially. And it could be a call from just a regular 415, an argument, to somebody actually, being violated. So, it's tough, man. But I think Mr. Combs pretty much touched on it. So.
All right. Go ahead. All right, Mr. White.
Yeah, to Walt's point, and also Greg's point, it's a cultural shift, I think, that we have to recognize. And there is a sense of weakness that can be associated with seeking help. So with leaders, I think it's important for us to set the example. And it's the same in law enforcement, military, chaplains are those some folks that I, even on myself on the military side, is that I routinely reach out to and speak to, because I want those that work alongside me to set the example, to know that that's okay. for you to seek help, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to cope with some of the things that you see on a day-to-day basis. And then also, to Walt's point, I don't take the job home. There's certainly sometimes, depending on what your assignment may be, you may have to think about things that you have to do tomorrow, sometimes operation, those type of things. But I think that it's important that you separate the two, and you separate your circles, so the majority of your time out of work is not thinking about work. So you should never be at home thinking about work, and you should never be at work thinking about home. So I think that that's important. Have some healthy outlets, exercise, surround yourself with positive people, and I think that's the key.
All right, thank you. Separate circles. I'm writing that down. I think that's something that can help us in all walks of life, regardless of what your vocation is, to be able to compartmentalize work from home and work from personal life and all that. Thank you for that. That was amazing. Brother Charlie, you have the next 2 questions?
Kefion, I don't know if you noticed that we had Wayman join the call.
Was he here? Okay.
Yeah, so Wayman, if you can kind of quickly introduce yourself and also answer that question. Did you hear that question, Wayman?
Yes, I did. Sorry for my tardiness, but it's an honor to be on this Zoom meeting with all these faces I see in here, especially Mr. Combs. I haven't seen him in a while. I looked up to him as a youngster and as a young officer coming up, so I really appreciate him. And so just to introduce myself again, I'm Wayman Furman. I'm a council member in the city of Indio. I'm also an 18-year veteran in the correctional system with the state. And I'm also vice chairman of the Coachella Valley Association of Governments Public Safety Committee. And so going back to the question, I echo all the sentiments that were said. The difference in my situation was, or I should say is I work an hour and 15 minutes away from home. So that drive home sometimes is coupled with a prayer, meditation, or some music to help me decompress from traumatic experiences at work. I work in a level 4 state prison, so I see a lot of violence, a lot of use of force, and a lot of other things that I don't even want to mention. So the scary part about the mental aspect of that is sometimes you get desensitized to some of those things. And I noticed that over my career. And as I was involved in one of the last riots I was in, and there was a lot of force being used, and I've seen some things. And I talked to my lieutenant afterwards during our debriefing, and that's one of the things that I encourage officers to do. And when we would have, traumatic experiences, we would always debrief because I was part of a specialized unit. And so I told him, I said, you know what was the scariest part of the riot? That my heart didn't even race, my blood didn't pump, it became normalized. And that was one of the things that I looked in the mirror and said, maybe I need to talk to somebody about that, whether it was going to be a chaplain, a partner, or someone who had more experience in this about mental wellness. And so at that point, I really started to speak with younger officers or younger experienced officers about taking mental health and making it as important as physical health. And because with that mental health, you could perform your job a lot better and also keep yourself out of situations. And also you go home a little bit more healthier. One of the things that I learned with experience is, I think Tim talked about this, is shedding that alpha male ego concept, of the job, because we do encounter that. But when you have influential officers that folks look up to, and it doesn't have to be a supervisor, they're the ones that we look to really talk to our officers about on that ego and how it could get yourself and other folks in trouble and also hurt. And so that debriefing is big, and shedding that ego is also big. And one of the other things that I do is hobbies. We all work out. The working out thing that helps me cope with my job. And also community engagement. A lot of times when you are quote unquote authoritarian figure, sometimes you carry that on your shoulder. But when you are around normal folks, church, sports activities, your youth activities, you see that everybody is not a criminal. Everybody's not out to get you. And sometimes subconsciously you think that. We all, the law enforcement community sometimes walk around in condition red, and that means we're on high alert all the time. High alert is anxiety, so sometimes we have to peel the skin back off the onion, so to speak, to be normal sometimes, so that's a lot of that is mental. And Tim talked about other circles. I think what's important is getting out of that uniform and showing folks that you are normal too, and talking to your loved ones sometimes about your job, because when you leave your home, there's a lot of folks that are not only dependent on you, they're worried about you. So sometimes you need to explain why I need to be alone, and I had a long day, or I got pepper spray all over me, So sometimes communication with your family and friends is a big key too, because they're also there to to be a shoulder to lean on, So those things help me cope with the mental aspect of my job. And also we do have.
Okay, wait a minute, real quick. Let me jump in. Two things. Yeah. One, whoever's phone is not muted, I need you to mute it, because I don't want to mute everyone, because we're gonna open up in a minute. And two, yeah. You missed the very beginning. We only have 3 minutes to answer each question. All right.
Okay.
So well, thank you for that. Go ahead. You can finish.
I think I get an exception, because I can't do everything in 3 minutes. Keep you on now.
Yeah, you're gonna have to learn, brother. Hey, let me tell you something. If a preacher tells you we can do it in 3 minutes, you can do it in 3 minutes. So come on, you can finish your thought.
Okay. Well, I just want to finish on that last note though, about how you just made me lose my train of thought. But anyways, that's how I cope with the mental aspect of my job.
Okay. Mr. Irvin has the next two questions.
All right, we're gonna move on to the next question. Okay, so in our Zoom, we had a question or two that was brought up. And one of the questions that we had is, how can our demeanor, or how can our body language as a normal citizen, how can we conduct ourselves, and how can we control our demeanor and to allow us to be able to make it home?
Yeah.
And that question can start out with Greg.
I personally think, we have to use discernment, and we can't get emotional. I mean, we're all human. So like, if you feel that an officer is harassing you, or you were wrong somehow, you got to be smart about it. You can't get upset. And in law enforcement, they teach you officer safety. So when someone's agitated or upset, it helps to de-escalate. But then again, that officer, he's at heightened mode. So, if you're raising your voice and talking with your hands, these are like telltale signs of, okay, something's about to happen. But my best advice is just to kind of remain calm and really kind of just use your head, because it's easy for an officer to articulate why they use force on you, so you don't want to put yourself in that situation. But I would say just use discernment and not get emotional.
Great answer, Greg. Next, can we get Tim White?
Yeah, so I get asked that question a lot, and for the most part, most officers they just want to get home at night too. And the majority of officers, the vast majority of officers are out doing a good job, but they're human, and officers have emotions, and temperament is a factor as well. I had to realize that just even with my circle, so I've been a police officer for the past 20 years. So my interactions with law enforcement is going to be vastly different than the majority of Black males. And what I mean by that, if I identify myself as an officer, that my line of question can be different from what could be perceived as invasive questionings. and primarily my line of questioning would be work related, those type of things. As soon as I think that I identify myself as an officer, those barriers are broken. So I may not get those questions again that may appear evasive. What are you doing in this area? You have any weapons, any drugs in the car? And then again, those are pretty much standard questions regardless of color or race. But at the same time, if I'm an individual and I've got pulled over, and perhaps this is my 6th, 7th time being pulled over this month, I own my own business. Hey, perhaps I'm a member of the military, perhaps I'm a council member. And so what would make you think that I would have a weapon, or what would make you think that I would have anything illegal in the car? So those type of things I think can be annoying, and sometimes those can be flashpoints. But to what Greg said is that you got to know when to pick your battles, and realizing that just because you have been maybe stopped 6, 7 times this month, maybe 6 or 7 times you were stopped. Previous times the officer didn't treat you with the respect that you deserve. But if you've never encountered that officer, this is a fresh encounter for you. So for me, it's and we've all went through, and I tell you what, sometimes I'm in a hurry and I drive and say I cut somebody off, I'll be the first one to give them, hey, my fault. And if the reaction is, that's going to go a long way, that's going to be a different encounter than if somebody has a negative reaction. And I think just as humans, it's natural for us to respond as in kind to how we're being acted towards. So I think that that's important, understanding that everybody has a supervisor, and understanding that everybody has a day in court. And if you believe that you were treated unfairly, there's a time and a place, I think, to challenge that, to contest that. But out during the middle of a traffic stop, I mean, my best advice is just to really follow instructions, treat that officer with courtesy. And then I think that courtesy is going to be extended to you. And if not, there's an appeal, there's a complaint process that you can follow to make sure that your complaint and your voice is heard.
So kind of what you're saying is to make sure that you comply and do what you're told to do, and kind of make sure that you have your day in court, or you have your ability to be able to file a complaint if you need to.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think it's important that we remember that, and that's not the time for us to keep it real. And I can tell you, there's been times that again, it can be an emotional time, and then sometimes we may feel that we've done everything right, and there may be some times that you have done everything right, or maybe just the officer didn't take the time to explain it to you. But I think that it's important when we talk about this topic of we as a pedestrian can control the majority of how that interaction with that particular officer is going to go. Are there officers that don't have the necessary skill set, maybe not the amount of training, maybe the emotional intelligence to deal with different demeanors? Absolutely, and we're going to have some of that. But I think that we can control what we can control, and that's by simply following directions. And if you believe that you've been mistreated fairly, then you take that up to you file a complaint, you file an appeal with either that officer supervisor, and that's where you get your resolve.
Okay, thank you, Tim. So the next person will be Wayman.
The title of this panel was "How do I get home?" Right? I think that's a two-way street. It's also for the officer and for the pedestrian or the driver of this vehicle, or whoever's being encountered. I think sometimes we have to understand that everybody's human. So in one aspect, we don't know what call or how that officer's day has been. And so say you get pulled over and you're disrespectful or you're acting fidgety, that officer may be on high alert already from a previous call that he hasn't came down yet, or He just had bad experience. So that's why I think it's important to maintain a calm demeanor all the time and respectful. And regardless if you're the officer or the patron, the goal is to get home. Regardless if any right was violated, we could sort that out later. Tim said it's not the time right now to keep it real, because that's when things go bad. As soon as sometimes we say, I know my rights, that's a sign that this is going to be kind of conflictual. Listen to what the officer's saying, try to follow the orders as much as possible. Even if he says, I'm gonna place you in handcuffs because I don't feel safe. Sometimes we think just because we're being placed in handcuffs, we're under arrest. That don't mean you're under arrest. Or if you're being detained, because you're being detained don't mean you're under arrest. And regardless if it's right or wrong, we can sort that out later. The goal is for you to go your way and him to go his way, whether it's with the ticket, if it's counseling, or if it's however we're going to finish it. So I think just being calm and following orders. Earlier, my brother talked to me about Florida. He said Florida, where he lives at, is a different animal than the Coachella Valley as it pertains to law enforcement and Black and brown folks. So I told him, have your registration and license ready to go. If you get pulled over at your visor, pull it down. You have it right there. Hands on the steering wheel, 10 and 2. We talked about that before. And be respectful. Officer sees that you have your stuff out already and you're showing your hands. 9 times out of 10, he's going to say, you know what? I'm going to be respectful. This guy knows what he's doing, or woman knows what they're doing, and follow directions, you know. And the goal is for the officer to get home at the end of his shift, and the goal is for you to get home to your family.
Thank you, Wayman. I appreciate that. Walter, you're next.
I just really want to echo what everybody said. When you get pulled over, when you get stopped, the first 20 seconds is going to determine how that outcome is going to happen. And we've seen enough traffic stops, and we've seen enough interaction with the police officers that we know that there are certain things that police officers need when they stop you: license, registration, proof of insurance. Once you give those items, then who knows how it's going to go from that point. But it's about what the officer needs and what you as a civilian has to produce at that point. I've seen in my experience where officer walks up and the driver would say, "Why you pull me over?" I can tell you that it's probably not going to go well for that driver in terms of that driver is probably going to get a ticket. What else could happen after that? Lord only knows. But the officer is going to ask for certain things. If you produce those certain things, 9 times out of 10, as Wayman said, that interaction is going to go well in terms of what the officer is going to do in terms of ticket, not ticket, whatever the case may be. Sometimes they talk about, and it's getting a little bit deep, where officer pulls somebody over for jaywalking. We all know that jaywalking is a simple infraction, but there's been cases where people have died because of their interaction, how it goes south from there. It's just about respecting what the officer has to do and giving that officers the space to do their business, and then everybody leaves from there. Again, I'm just echoing what everyone else said is officer has a job to do, and 9 times out of 10, if that officer is allowed to take care of what they need to take care of, there's generally no further interaction from that point.
All right. Thank you for your comment, Walter. I think we're going to lead back the next question, starting off with you. The next question is, we're seeing a widespread of SRO officers being removed from campus. SRO is school resource officers. The Black Lives Matter has a push in different cities in Los Angeles, all over the world. They're removing the SRO officers from campus. The schools are spending an enormous amount of money on these SRO officers. How do you feel about the SRO officers And would you leave them there, or how would you handle that situation?
Well, I haven't looked at the overall argument for removing them, other than certain conversations about defunding the police department. I think there are several cities within the Coachella Valley, I believe Palm Springs is one of them, that school resource officer actually does criminal justice courses in the morning, other than just patrolling the schools. So if we talk about community engagement and having police officers actually teaching the students some of the stuff that we're talking about here today, I think that would be a positive point to having them at schools. One thing would concern me is the violence that we've seen with school shootings. I think a little bit more research needs to be taken concerning that, because we know that our high schools and elementary schools in some cases have been the most violent places in America over the last several years. I think if you remove that law enforcement officer from those schools, I think that would be something that could come back to bite us.
Okay. And so, all right, well, we'll move on to the next panelist. We'll go to Tim on the next question. I mean, Tim, for the question that we just asked Walter.
So yeah, so they're vital. In my opinion, school resources are a must, and I understand that there's budgetary constraints, but the school resource officers is not a position where you want to take cuts, because they act as a deterrent. If you go back just into the 2000s, just back in 2000 alone, there have been 290 shootings, over 290 shootings. We hear about the large ones, Sandy Hook, of course, the Parkland shooting that just occurred here in Florida, because they gained the most media attention, and then going all the way back to Columbine in 1999. But just having that officer on campus alone is going to be a deterrent. And I would say, since law enforcement officers in general, since the Columbine response, have really changed their tactics in how they respond to a school shooting. And if you think about it, this March has been the first March since 2002 that we haven't had a school shooting. You know that schools are out, and right now civil unrest is COVID. Those things happen to be front and center stage. But think about, prior to these two events, what has it been? It's been mass shootings. So when we look at them, so when community leaders, when we look at making cuts, that isn't a place that you wanna take cuts. In addition to that, school resource officers, they're going to be sometimes that bridge between the officer and the community they serve, because they're the ones that's going to have the most interactions with the kids at that school. So I think that position is vital. And if we say just the amount of shootings that we have, because someone that's going to do a school shooting, they're going to look for soft targets, and schools with school resource officers on them are not considered soft targets. So I think that we prevented a lot of school shootings, despite the numbers that we've had, simply because there are school resource officers in place. And I think they're vitally important.
Okay. Next question is for Greg.
Yeah, I think the SROs are necessary, but what I would like to have is putting people in those positions that's willing to engage the community, engage the kids. Because you have to understand, historically, law enforcement and Black people or people of color, there hasn't been the best relationship. I mean, within my father's lifetime, peaceful protesters were beat in the street by law enforcement officers. So if you look at that issue and it's passed down from generation and say, well, during the 60s, if I was, assaulted, they're all bad. So you can kind of see what that disconnect is there. I think you need somebody there that obviously, like Tim touched on, that's going to be a deterrent for like any kind of criminal activity, especially shootings, but also just kind of, connecting with the younger folks and connecting with the parents to say, hey, I'm engaged, we're here. Because some people look at that position as like a kickback position, and maybe that officer is just doing the bare minimum just to get through his day. But I think it's a very, very important position because, again, just engaging with the younger folks, and you see what they're doing out there now. They're making a difference. I'm proud of this generation, my daughter's generation. I mean, I haven't seen anything like what's going on, like nationwide, not in my lifetime, within my father's lifetime. But again, just going back to the SRO, I think they're needed, most definitely.
Okay. And do any of you guys know of any SRO officers? Do you know how they conduct themselves on campus? Do they write reports? Are the reports sent to the school district, or are those reports sent back to the police department? How do they handle the engagements and the activities that they
Hey,
have?
Charlie, real quick, and Keithion, my buddy Brian Bickman, he's a retired sergeant with the sheriff's department. I kind of wanted to get him into the rotation. I know it's kind of like we're already doing our thing, but he has a lot of insight, just like Tim. They actually work together. If you guys don't mind me saying that.
Brian, man, it's good
No,
to
not
see
at
you
all.
again, brother.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
bring
is.
it in.
I'm new to this platform. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Can
you.
you hear me? Yeah, I'm new to this platform. Brother Hollis invited me last week and today, and so yeah, I'm very opinionated. I'll be brief. The question concerning SROs on campus, yeah, they're very much needed. Unfortunately, I won't even call it a color barrier as much as it is just a lack of understanding on a part of, persons who, this, like Brother Hollis said, hey, his daughter, and in his lifetime, we've not seen anything on this scale. But I think a lot of folks don't recognize that racism as a whole is, in fact, a problem. And the denial it may be a one-sided point of view, but I tend to believe that people don't want to take issue with it or deal with it because either they don't know how or they don't see it as a problem. So yeah, I think as far as SROs are concerned, you want to have people that are culturally attuned to what's going on, specifically not just people of color, but someone who really wants to serve in that capacity. And I do think they do play a vital role at that level. But as it relates to what we, as working professionals, retirees, and people who have a little bit more knowledge about what's going on, I told Brother Hollis recently that we can use the various platforms to put out the message. I think this meeting is outstanding because we're all coming together for a common purpose, for the sole intent of trying to pass on knowledge, but also trying to engage people in a way that's meaningful to them and try to maybe build on ideas that we all share. I noticed there's in the comment section about systemic racism. I don't mean to bounce all over. I mean, I'm kind of coming into this trying to learn, but so that is a major problem, especially, within law enforcement as a whole, systemic racism. Anyone who says that it isn't a problem is either in denial or they're just ignorant. It's really sad when people won't own the truth or acknowledge, what's really going on, because I think that is the problem there. I mean, you have folks who believe that they can you guys hear me? I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. If you can, if you can wrap it up, we have a couple of questions. We're going to get to those questions.
Okay, all right, that's fair enough. Yeah, but simply put, man, the bottom line is it is a concerted effort on the part of everybody that's involved. So I'll leave it with that and just not ramble on, just to hear what everyone else has to say and kind of piggyback on what they have.
Thank you for your time. The question goes to Wayman.
Okay, I want to refer to President Obama's 21st century policing. One of his pillars is community-oriented policing, and I think the SRO serves as part of that and engagement with our youth. Our SRO in the city of Indio is well liked and has well communication skills with the students. But what we have to, our generation right now, they're doing great work, and I'm proud of them. But we got here for a reason. Mr. Combs could probably attest to this also. In the 90s and the 2000s, we had a lot of gang problems at our schools. So it was vital to have that officer there. That officer went from a law enforcement officer now to a community-oriented policing officer. It serves as a good nexus between our youth and the police department. So I think it's needed. And also going back to the active shooter situation, I mean, it is a deterrent, you know, and most cases of active shooters are over within 2 minutes. That's not enough time for a department to get suited up and respond. Most of the times the damage is done and they commit suicide. So there needs to be immediate response. And just having my son just graduate from high school, we've had about 6 incidents where we were either emailed or called that there was either someone being chased through the high school with a firearm or somebody was on campus with a firearm. Just knowing that there was an officer there made me feel a little bit more safer. So we got here for a reason. I just think that what we have to do is talk about funding for our school districts. I think we could find funding for ethnic studies in our school districts so we could teach each other about each other's cultures and the contributions we make for our cultures. I think that's where taking the SRO comes out. We want to defund the police. I think we're looking in the wrong direction for that funding. I think we need to look for some federal grants to help our school districts out, because the school districts contract the cities to put an officer there. So I think that's where that whole reallocating of funding comes from.
Thank you, Amy.
All right, I'm gonna ask, it's 6:43, but we're gonna do the best we can to get these questions asked. And I would ask if you all would be opposed to doing this again in a few weeks, because I know we're gonna have follow-up questions. And I didn't want this to be a one-time thing, but more of a dialogue. Would you brothers be willing to do this again?
Absolutely, on my end.
All right, thank you. Okay, so next question. And we might as well just go ahead and jump into one of the questions that were asked in the chat. We can tie it into to this one. How important do you all feel that people of color get involved in law enforcement, whether it be officers or in the criminal justice system? And in your opinion, do you feel that there is a systemic racism problem when it comes to law enforcement? We'll start with Tim. We'll go to Wayman, go to Sergeant Combs, and then Mr. Hollis. And if the other gentleman is still on, we'll give him 3 minutes as well.
So the first part, it's vitally important that we get people of color, blacks, into policing, because we talk for 2 reasons. We talk about change, and we need change. The only way that you're going to affect change is from the inside. And at some point during our childhood, I think every boy, girl, boys especially, you're given a fire truck, you're given a police car, and how many kids grow up thinking that they want to be police officers. And then at some point during adolescence, it becomes sometimes a dream for some to something that is considered not popular in sometimes in the communities that we live. So I think it's vitally important, because we want officers to represent the communities that they serve. And how are we going to get officers that represent the community that we serve unless we have more black men, more black women that decide to become officers? So I think that it's important, and that's the same for the entire criminal justice system. And that's police officers, defense attorneys, prosecutors, and judges. And I think it's vitally important. And as far as the second question, as far as systemic racism, absolutely. And I think that anyone would be in denial if we would say as a whole that there isn't systemic racism in law enforcement, in some of the other organizations, only because we are a segment of society. And I think for the most part, agencies do their best to try to weed out some of those individuals. and we sometimes condone it, or we say, we use the term bad apples. And we realize there's problems in our organization, and we say, hey, most of our officers are good, but we got a few bad apples. And law enforcement is one of those few areas that that has unfortunately been accepted. I don't think any one of us would go and take a flight and we walk up to go and check in, and as we're getting ready to board the flight, they tell us, hey, most of our pilots are good. We got a few bad apples,
Come on now.
have a safe flight. And, or we're going to go in for a surgery, and most of our doctors are good, but we do have a few bad apples right when I'm getting ready to have a heart surgery. But for some reason, we've just accepted that. So that's a part of it that we need to change. And I think that what's important about this movement, and what's different about what's occurring now, is that I think that leaders at all levels within law enforcement organizations, not just law enforcement, we're doing a deep dive into the military, the Air Force right now, as well as combating these issues. And the first step is to acknowledge that that they exist, and start the discussion, because that's the only way that we're going to fix it.
I believe we went to Wayman next.
Well, what I'll do on this one, I'll go back to my own personal experiences and career. Through my negative experiences with law enforcement as a teenager growing up in India, I decided, you know what, I'm going to go into this field and I'm going to change it from the inside out. And once I got in, I was able to do that. But during that process, I did notice the systemic racism within the law enforcement community, but it's embedded in our country, and it's embedded in the law enforcement, how law enforcement started. Policing started from catching slaves, and confinement started from, we needed to confine them. So if we don't teach that history, and folks understand where that tension comes from, we're never going to beat it. And Tim spoke about that. We need to start the conversation and have it. But a lot of times you will be surrounded with folks that you work with, your peers, and there'll be a racist comment or a sexist joke. And if you don't put a stop to that, or go deeper to where that came from, it's just going to keep evolving. And those are the things that happen that we need to stop in their tracks. And it's a cultural thing. And I spoke about this earlier. We could have all the policies we want, and we could change them, add them, and subtract them. But if the culture is bad, you're going to have those quote unquote bad apples. So the culture starts from those influential officers and from the top with your police chiefs on down the line. And they set the tone what's going to be accepted in that department, because at the end of the day, that shadiness will rise to that top. And all the officers know who that one officer is, who is that bad apple. We know, so, but now it's at a point to where we have to look in the mirror and say, I got to speak up, because if not, I'm contributing to that behavior. And that's what we've seen in Minneapolis. Those officers had bad culture there, and none of them stepped up to pull that other officer out of that situation and preventing him from killing George Floyd. So a lot of it's culture, but the systemic racism is there. And to stop it, we got to speak out against it and stop it in its tracks.
Mr. Combs, I'm sorry.
Yes, I remember when I first started testing for law enforcement, I went for this interview, and the question was asked, what would you do if you were standing at a bus stop and a police officer stopped and got out of the car and searched you and then took off? How would you feel about that? And here I am sitting in a panel of law enforcement professionals, and I'm thinking, okay, do I say what I want, what I think they want to hear, or do I, tell how I really feel? So I chose to tell them how I really felt. When I told them I was pissed off, I would be pissed off if somebody, police officer, drove by, searched me, and then took off, and without any explanation. So I answered that question, and I went on about my way, and I just knew there's no way that I'm going to get this job because they're seeing me as a militant or somebody that's not what they're looking for. And probably about 3 days later, I got a call from that police agency, and they wanted to hire me as a police officer for their city. I didn't take that job, but from that point on, I realized that if you want to make changes, and they saw that in me, and if you want to make changes, you need somebody with that temperament, you need somebody with that thinking inside the police department that knows what it feels like to be discriminated against, that knows what it feels like to be searched, that knows those things about what's happening in the police department. So yes, we need more African-American minorities inside police agencies because they get it. They understand what it feels like to be discriminated against. They understand what it feels like to have somebody lock their doors when you walk by. You know, they understand exactly what you're dealing with. So when you approach someone, you already know how they're going to respond, or you believe you already know how they're going to respond, and you approach it from a different perspective than say somebody that doesn't have that experience. I grew up in Brooklyn, and the last thing on earth was I going to be a police officer. It's not something that was in my realm of even thinking. But once I became a law enforcement officer, I realized that it's a duty. It's not just a gun and a badge. It's a duty to serve in that capacity. It's a duty. It's a responsibility. And once I understood that, whenever I was in a situation where I could affect or I can change something, I felt good about the situation. If I can de-escalate a situation, or if my presence stop somebody from being assaulted or being taken advantage of, I held that in the highest regards. So back to the other point, yes, there is systemic racism in the police department. And Tim and the rest of us, we're all out there trying to do our part to prevent it, stop it, and our mere presence in a lot of cases stops that. But the awareness that we're seeing now allows us to speak about this on Facebook, allows us to speak openly about it. In certain cases, we had to remain behind the scenes to do some of the things that we had to do to stop it. Now we can come out in front and discuss this and talk about these issues that we've seen over the course of our careers.
And Mr. Wayman, before we get to the next question, Mr. Furman. I'm sorry, Councilman Furman. Now go ahead. You're muted.
I know. I already answered this one. I think it's.
You already answered.
Who did I miss? Did I miss someone? Greg, Mr. Hollis.
Yeah, I'd say that obviously we do need more diversity in law enforcement. When I started in 2006, for 2 years at the NDO jail, I was the only deputy, the only officer who looked like me. And you know, you learn to have thick skin because things are said that can be perceived as being racist. And you know, you just try to just do your job and you know, go home. But as far as the systemic racism, I mean, obviously there is. I think Wayman touched on, you know, the history lesson, and that's what I think we should look at and how to solve some of these problems is looking at history so we can understand, okay, this is where we were, we got to bridge this gap and let's move forward. But I think some officers are less inclined to speak out, man, because of retribution. I mean, there is a blue, you know, a code of silence amongst law enforcement, to be honest. You know, like in the streets, they say no snitching. It's the same thing in law enforcement. So when you see an officer doing something unethical, you know, you got to have the courage to speak out. A lot of people aren't willing to do that because if they do it, then when you go to test to promote, somehow your name is high on the list, but you're not picked. And those are some of the gangs that you have to deal with. So I would encourage young Black and brown males and females to go into law enforcement but I will also caution them with saying, hey, do what you can do, but you're not going to change the system overnight. It's going to be a progression of, kind of just chipping away at it. And you need to be around like-minded folks. Like I was blessed because I worked with a good friend of mine, my man, Brian Bickman. He was one of my supervisors. And, it's good to have, like Wayman mentioned, you got to have your mentors and people kind of like looking out for you. But would you guess that there were people on our team, white guys, who said, oh, you and Bickman, you guys are friends outside of work and you guys are chummy here. We can't do that. But if we were white, I guarantee that would be okay. And I've seen that. And Brian, maybe you can touch a little more on it, but I'm just being honest about it. So that's it.
Hey,
Mr. Bigby, please. Oh, brother, Mr. White, go ahead.
Before Brian jumps on, so we own a part of that too. And I mean that from our community, because I know my agency, we put a lot of money in recruiting efforts into recruiting minorities and of all races and females. And but sometimes we just don't get the amount of applicants I think that we need to represent the communities that we serve. So it's a two-way street. So it's one thing that says that officers, we don't have enough minority officers, but at the same time, as community, and we got to teach our kids that it's okay, that you want to be officers, you want to be doctors, you want to be lawyers, those type of things, and then make it popular for them. So then when they grow up and they get to a certain age, that they're not ridiculed by their friends because you want to be an officer, you want to be a fireman, you want to be a lawyer, you want to be a doctor. That's, I think, a part that we can change to kind of help bridge that gap. So we own a part of that.
Mr. Bigby.
Hold on one second, Keefion. I want to answer back to Tim with that. Tim, what from the police aspect could you guys possibly do to be able to make the kids want to be law enforcement, make the kids think it's cool to be police officers? Because I think the relationship has been fractured from the aspect of the people that live in the community. How, as law enforcement, can you guys bridge that gap and bring us to want to be a police officer? The kids aspire to be a police officer. How can we do that?
So this group right here, right? Think about it. So think about how much influence that we have between how many young. So Charlie, you were a youngster when I was growing up, right? So I don't have that same connection with the youngsters in the area that you do. So I think that it's important for us as is to mentor that generation behind us, and for you to do the same. And I think that's what we're doing here. So police officers, we can do so much, and I think that you can have all the recruiting and all the retention efforts that we can. Yeah. But within our own culture, if it's from the time you were a teenager, you learn that being a cop, that's not, being snitch. I think somebody talked about it. That's not the way to go. Then how are we going to get those applicants? So I think a lot of that is on us. And I think that in Walter, and if you know Walter, you would see whether it's a Black History Parade, whether it was something out there on the North End, you would always see Walter engage with the community. So there's certain things that officers that we can do, but there are certain things that we can do as parents, as community leaders, as mentors to help bridge that gap as well.
Before I get to Mr. Bigby, let me say this, and this is coming from a civilian perspective, a Black man with Black children, specifically a 10-year-old Black girl who was deathly afraid of law enforcement. And that was something that I really had to do from a parent perspective to show her that law enforcement, they're not the bad guys, because you don't want to perpetuate that mentality to where when she gets older, she just assumes everyone with a badge is out to get them. And so one thing that we did, and I work with all of our police chiefs in Desert Hot Springs, one thing I've always done is brought the chief and a couple of squad cars to the church, to community forums and fairs, so the kids can get inside the car and push the buttons and all that kind of stuff. Because again, if they're impressionable right now, and if we can get to them right now, I think that'll help change that cycle and change that culture. But I so appreciate Brother White saying, hey, this is how law enforcement will approach it. But from a community, we got to approach it from a different way as well. And I love how he said that's what this group is for, this kind of conversation, to say we're not going to put all the onus on the shoulders of law enforcement. We're going to actually pick up some of that slack ourselves. Mr. Bigby, you didn't get a chance to answer that particular question. And Brother Greg, you already hinted at our next question. So I'm going to let Mr. Bigby answer that part of the question, and we're going to get into these bad apples.
Okay, great. I'll be brief. You know, speaking on what we can do, I mean, I can recall a number of times when I was on the job, I would volunteer my time, and I volunteered with the Boys and Girls Club of Coachella Valley. And actually, we a group of us men would mentor to troubled kids, but kids who were interested. And I always made it a point to try to emphasize and talk about what they can do and talk about what I was able to do as a peace officer. It's a mindset, and it's just trying to encourage kids who probably think less of themselves or probably don't think that they're capable of becoming a police officer or a sheriff's deputy, that, you know, it's possible. So, you know, I would share my story, and a bunch of us guys who volunteered our time shared our story. So, you know, that to me, I think is a first thought. I mean, obviously, volunteering your time and trying to reach out to kids that are not necessarily troubled, but youth of color, and encourage them to enter the profession. Systemic racism, again, it's all about worldview and being open-minded and willing to listen to others and try to understand, because to me, in my opinion, I think that's part of the problem. I mean, I can't tell you how many times people that I've worked with who were not willing to even have a discussion about racism in general and about how I, as a black person, feel and how they even feel. You know, I would be willing to sit down and talk to them to try to, you know, understand. But when you're in a supervisory position or a position of a managerial position of leadership, I think you have a duty and an obligation to do everything you can to have discussions around those issues. When you fail to do that, to me, you're derelict in your job. But that's just my 2 cents. But I think it starts, I believe it was the councilman who talked about the role of the SRO and how the SRO in the schools, how we can bring that maybe perhaps in ethnic studies or make that part of the curriculum, even if not a part of the curriculum, have volunteers, even civilian volunteers, go into, I don't know how that would work, into the school or have even after school sessions where you can kind of mentor and try to encourage and specifically talk about some of these things that we're talking about if we're permitted to do that. So not sure how that would work, but that's just my 2 cents.
All right. Brother Greg, you kind of stepped in it. You kind of opened Pandora's box when you talked about good officers reporting what they see that's negative. And I believe it was Brother White who mentioned the bad apples and said that how regardless of if you're going to catch a fly, you know, most of our pilots are good, but we got a couple bad apples. That wouldn't be acceptable. And so the question is, why is it acceptable to us? Why does it seem acceptable that we can have bad apples in law enforcement? There is this culture of a blue wall. And in all my years of being a pastor in this city, we've had 4 police community forums, and each one, the police officers will come and say, the chief will come and say, help us help you. If you see something, we need you to say something. We understand that snitching is not the norm, but if we're going to change anything in the city, we need you all to cooperate with us. And so we're asking now from the other side, why is it so hard for police officers to say something about a bad apple? Is the blue wall that thick, or is it actually starting to come down a little bit? We'll start with Brother Furman, then Mr. Combs, Mr. White, Mr. Hollis.
I think policing and law enforcement as a whole has been so secretive, and that's something that we're kind of taught at the beginning. For instance, when I ran for council, I knew I had to put my whole personal life out there, my business out there, and I was like, nah, you know what? That was something that I've been bred not to do. Now, when I talk education, and there's a lot that goes into this question, but when I talk education, we need to talk how our systems work, how we have internal affairs and who they're comprised of. and how some of these other things that we're talking about with the 21st century policing and community oversight, how we need to communicate with the community what we're doing. If there's a high profile case or a high profile case of bad use of force and it's being investigated, we need to let the public know it's under investigation. And if we dispel anything, his due process rights may be violated and we could possibly lose the case. You don't hear stuff like that. It'll just be closed off. And I think communication is the key. And a lot of times folks want body cam footage, folks want answers, but sometimes we have to understand that if there's something that goes on, there's due process for everyone. So I think communication is big. And is there a blue wall? Of course there is, but it starts at the top and it starts with the culture. And when you put it in your department or in your circles that it's not going to be tolerated, and you have to follow through. But I think communication with the public is key. And serving as a council member, I went to my chief and I said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have quarterly forums outside of the chamber, not where we're in an uncomfortable position. We're going to go out in the community where folks get ask questions of the chief and his assistant chiefs, you know, or if there's issues going on in the community that need to be addressed. Because sometimes if we have a council member, folks are not comfortable going to council members, or our council meetings start at 5 o'clock. Some people are not even home from work yet. So we are going to have quarterly meetings where people can address our chief. And also we have other engagement opportunities. National Night Out, if COVID permits, will be happening where folks will come out and meet some of your officers. And I think, you know, that engagement is big in breaking down this gap between community and police, especially here locally. I think countrywide, we have some bigger issues and on different parts of the country. California has a lot of training, and I think we have the best training, but we have to admit that some parts of our country, some police departments are embedded with white supremacists and other social cultural groups. So other parts of the country have it a lot worse than we do.
Okay, and I thank you for being candid there, but let me get a little bit more closer to home, because we're talking about situations that the public can find out about, and we're saying, yeah, all right, we're going to blow the whistle on that. I believe the nature of the question was, let's just say the George Floyd situation, had that not been caught on camera and went viral, 3 officers stood there and watched idly by while 1 officer did what he did. So, I mean, let's just imagine for a minute, if that video hadn't gone viral, would we even know what happened? Would one of those 3 officers had been bold enough to say, I got to break the blue wall and I got to come forward? That's the question that we're asking here is, what do you guys feel about that portion of the blue wall and how do we address it?
Well, Pastor Kifian, let me just answer that one real quick. I tell you this right here, those incidents have happened in our country and they've happened before. Just the difference is now they're being recorded.
Right.
Now, going back to that also, there's vices, and that's why I say we need to educate the public, and we need to be a little bit more transparent in that aspect of the internal affairs investigations, how they play out and what's being investigated. And when you don't hear that, sometimes silence sounds like you're part of the perpetrator, you're part of the problem. So we need to let folks know what part of the process we're in. And as far as the officers reporting, there's ways for officers to report confidentially within law enforcement agencies. Now, will they do it? Some don't have confidence in their agencies that it's going to be confidential, because if it gets out, there's going to be fear of retribution. Just like when we go back to the mental health thing, sometimes we ask ourselves, okay, if I'm going to ask for help, if I'm going to ask for mental help, now, if I ask for mental help, are they going to take my firearm away from me? They take my firearm away from me, I can't work, you know? So those are some of the worries that you have. But there are vices where officers can report other officers for misconduct.
All right, and then let's, I don't remember the order I gave. If you remember it, next man up.
It's me, I'm up.
Okay, thank you.
Wayman hit on a couple of things, and the question that you ask is complex and it's several different levels. But I think the George Floyd incident brought it to a point where officers should feel comfortable stopping those types of abuses. Obviously at that level, that is the most egregious, but I think hopefully it's made it more possible for officers to come forward and say, hey, knock it off, don't do this, don't do that. but as Wayman talked about earlier, the bigger issue is police officers' Bill of Rights and making sure that the officers are held accountable and that their rights are not violated. I know you've heard and it's been talked about police unions, and California has probably one of the biggest police unions that I know of. And those officers are protected. So if you have an officer that puts his career on the line to out that officer and nothing happens to that officer, then he or she has to work with that officer for the next 20, 30 years. And some officers may not be willing to do that. One thing that I've heard that I've been encouraged by, and it's something that I think we're starting to take more of an active role in, is why are we letting officers, you take the Minnesota officer, I think he had 19 citizens complaints. How is he still working in law enforcement with 19 citizens complaints? That's unbelievable. So I've heard talk, and I'm encouraged by it, that information is going to be published out to for all to see. As community leaders, you want to know that. How many officers at the police department have 1 citizen complaint, 2, 5? What is going to be the criteria that says, hey, this officer has 5 citizens complaints for use of force, for unbiased policing? Police chief, what are you doing about it? And when you start asking questions to police chiefs and to city council members, those officers are going to be gone, and they're going to be gone very quickly. Once the information gets out that these people are being held and being retained at these police agencies for their entire career with all these citizens' complaints, I think that's going to make the cities and police agencies look at those police officers and say, you know what, obviously they don't uphold what the citizens want, and we need to remove them from the police department. You take the shooting in Atlanta. That police officer that shot 2 weeks ago, I think he has 12 citizens complaints in 7 years. I mean, those are red flags that police agencies need to be taking a look at. And we as a community, we need to set parameters that when a police officer has 5 citizens complaint and the use of force, is that what's happening with that officer? Is he or she being retrained? Is that officer being retained at the police department? And if so, why is it? And I think once those questions are started to come out, I think you'll see a change in the culture, because officers will understand, you know what, business as usual is over.
Was it Mr. White next?
All right, so I'll start this by saying nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop, and leadership really starts from the top, and it really is from the field sergeant. I can tell you, as a field sergeant, I had the luxury of working special teams throughout my career, and if you were on my team knew that, hey, I would risk my life for any of you, but I'm not risking my job for none of them. And what that mean was, hey, if it's go time and we got to put ourselves in a dangerous situation, then that's what we get paid to do. At the same time, if you do something that's unethical, immoral, or illegal, hey, then that's on you. Don't put me in that situation, because it's not anything that I'm going to condone. And I think that from the field level to department heads is what that culture needs to be. And the second piece of it is that you get what you pay for. And what I mean by that is that when we talk about defunding the police and those type of things, I think why in California particularly, I know within our agency in Palm Springs as well, there's a significant investment in training. And I think that we need to apply more dollars to officers to make sure that they're getting that adequate training. And then what I mean by when you get what you pay for, you kind of get those officers that don't have those type of things in our record, because it's an officer that would be released from a credible agency might go someplace else, making half the salary, and that whatever he was released for, he or she released for at his or her previous agency could potentially follow them into that next agency. So when you look down in some of the areas where we've been having, I think, some of these issues too, I think you can equate those to, I think, to the training and how much you actually invest in your department. And so I think for the most part, I think that is what's broken, and I believe that's what's going to take to fix it.
All right. Listen, we're going to do this. We got 7-8 minutes, and there's 2 pressing questions. So I'm going to ask these 2 questions, and whoever wants to take, give us insight on them, we'll do that. And then everyone who is still pressing for questions, what we're going to do is they've already agreed to do a second round to continue this discussion. So the questions that we don't get to, we're going to make sure that they get them. So our next round, they'll lead with those questions. Okay. The first one was, what is your response to the perception that officers are walking off the job because they're now being held accountable for misconduct? So with the Ahmaud Brooks shooting in Atlanta, news that the whole squad, that shift, didn't show up to work because they were protesting that the officer was fired. What are your impressions about that? What does that look like to you? And help us understand why that's acceptable.
Bro, real quick, it's not acceptable. Like I said, man, I just graduated nursing school. That's like me taking on a number of patients and saying, okay, I'm gonna walk away. I mean, I think once you swear and you take that oath and you say, hey, I'm gonna do what I have to do to protect my community, that's what you got to do. Obviously, in law enforcement, things are changing right now, and for some people, those changes don't sit well with them. So, hey, I think that with some folks leaving, maybe that's a good thing, and bring in people to replace them that's actually going to do what they're supposed to be doing.
Anyone else with that?
I think we talked about it earlier in California, and some of those police departments back east, them walking away from the job is not going to hurt them that bad. They might be able to find another job that pays them as probably the same. Here in California, you know what? Officers are paid pretty good, and we have pretty good training. That's why we're held to a high standard, and if officers are going to walk off because the law is being upheld, then you know what? We don't need you. You know what? We don't need you. We'll find somebody else. And we have, if that's going to be the weeding out process, they're going to walk off the job. You know what? That's fine. And that goes back to the diversity. We do need more diversity in our police departments, and if that's going to be how it's going to happen over there, then, so be it.
Yeah, I would add that I heard that, and I think several other agencies, police officers are working up the job. And it goes back to my earlier point, is that why are you in this profession in the first place? And if you're in the profession for the right reason, then you will show up to work and do what you're actually doing, what you're paid to do. If you're not in it for the right reasons, then you will fall victim to that, and you will be susceptible to walking off. So I understand if some folks feel that they haven't been doing the job right and they haven't been upholding what they signed on to do, then I think they have every right to leave and go do something else. You don't want officers patrolling your streets and protecting your neighborhoods that have that mentality, that especially if they see the Mr. Brooks shooting and feel that society has turned against them. They shouldn't be on the job, and they should walk off.
All right, so here's the last question, and it's a doozy. It's kind of a long one. It's so long I have to read it. This came from someone in the chat, and this is those that are leaving their email addresses. Thank you. We'll collect them, and when we schedule the next talk, we'll blast it on social media as well as let you know individually. The question is, how are the police supposed to be licensed family and marriage counselors, licensed mental health counselors, or anything to deal with problems that shouldn't end in arrest? I believe police should have at least a AA degree or a bachelor's degree. Others who deal with the public require a degree. If you go to college, you'll meet a diverse group of culture and learn what people are dealing with in their lives. Change also comes from education. So I guess the nutshell, the gist of the question is saying, it seems as if police officers only know 0 to 60, stop and arrest. How can they intervene with issues concerning marriages and mental health and all that kind of stuff with no education? They're asking, should there be an education component to law enforcement, or is it just a 9-month academy and get them the badge? And please place your phones on mute, please.
Hey, I'll start that one.
Yes, sir.
So some agencies have that requirement, but it's a balance. It's a balance behind obtaining recruits and recruiting against other agencies who may not have that requirement. So if you directly out of high school and say you haven't finished college and Department A is hiring without a college degree, but Department B requires one, then Department B is going to be hard to compete for those officers. So as we look at recruiting and retention, that's a piece of it that plays into it. But also, most agency, I know the agency that I work for, they offer degree incentives, and our department promotes education. And if you have a bachelor's degree, you get a certain percentage, and if you have a master's degree, you get a certain percentage. And as well as you promote, those things are taken into consideration as you move up within the department. So education is important, and it's that fine balance between maintaining that requirement that will, in some instances, exclude a segment of society that doesn't have that education. The other piece of it, you can get some of those things from other walks of life, other experiences. I can tell you that someone that's probably 30 years old that has probably been out of the home and lived on their own and been through relationships and trials and tribulations, they're going to have a different skill set than someone that's probably fresh out of college, even with a degree. You have folks that come out of the military that have a different skill set, experience, leadership qualities. So I think it's a fine balance. Anything that you have, education is good, but at the same time, you just got to understand that there's a certain target pool, and we've got to be careful that we don't eliminate a certain segment of the population. But education is good.
Anyone else want to fire away at that one? This is our final question.
Well, real quick, I just think that I know for Riverside County, you just have to be 20 and a half to apply, or start the academy rather, because it's a 6-month academy, or maybe things changed since I left. I don't know, but I mean, you're talking about a 21-year-old essentially dealing with issues that can alter someone else's life. So I think obviously, it's good to have, like Tim mentioned, somebody who has more life experience. That would be. I think that's the kind of person you're looking for in an officer. As far as like having a degree, again, Tim touched on that as well, with it's competition, because, in law enforcement, you're always going to be short-staffed, just like other occupations. So, departments are looking, okay, how do we get more bodies? I don't know how much was spent for the NDO jail, but they can't even staff it. All that money could have went towards education or something else. So just what Tim said, I agree with.
Another component of that is as a council member, when we hear the reallocation of funding, one thing that we did a year ago to be proactive, because of the high rate of mental health issues in our communities and our homeless communities, along with our quality of life team that actually works with the homeless population, we hired a social worker to actually go out with them. And I think that's part of changing the aspect and taking some of those duties away from some of those officers in that aspect. But to go back also to what Tim and Greg spoke on, I got hired as a young officer at 22 years old. My life experience wasn't that in depth. So I went into a level 4 state prison working with grown men, 50-year-old men, and having to deal with them and de-escalate situations and things like that. It's a lot easier now being a 40-year-old man than a 22-year-old man from life experience, and also talking with the inmates and learning how their culture is. And I think I learned more from dealing with them and learning from them than I did from any academy or any training that I received. And also, when I do a lot of career days or if I'm out talking to students, I encourage education, but I don't encourage it into law enforcement. I encourage it into psychology. I encourage it into communications. I encourage it into computers, because for the most part, the law enforcement duties you're going to learn in the academy and at your respective agency, and policies and procedures at respective agencies may be different at times. So I encourage education, and Tim spoke on the incentives of education in my department and also in the city of Indio. They're pretty high. And in the city of Indio, we have one Black officer, and our chief is actively pursuing Black officers and women to diversify our department, because that is a big component, and that is a plus when you have diverse people in your department, because you're going to have instances where that's going to work in your favor, and I might be able to de-escalate a situation that might be turning sideways just by my mere presence. So education, I think, is important and it's essential. Greg, just to clarify, that's not the Indio jail. That's the Riverside County jail. And that's not Indio, okay?
Hey,
so,
hey, but you know what? It just shows you how long I've been away, bro.
But you do have a point, because a lot of folks are upset about that, because those funds that we use, our county used to build that facility, and also it's going to cost to man it. And now with COVID, maybe that funding could have been used for something else. But that takes us back to a lot of other issues of recidivism and preventing folks from going into the institutions anyways. And that's why I started a men's group in my institution, so I could bring students there who are going into law enforcement, who are, and also troubled youth, to help stop the circle of recidivism. If I get a call tomorrow and my institution tell me they don't need me, I'll go find something else, and I'll be happy with that. But I think that's my mission now as an officer and as a council member, to stop that circle of recidivism.
And keep beyond it, it looks like listening to all of these gentlemen, it sounds like you know, you guys are saying age, but not education. But, you know, if education was a component that was used to maybe possibly get them up in age, you know, because once you finish college, you know, you got a little bit of age on you. So it sounds like I'm hearing that you guys are saying that education is needed, but you guys need bodies to be able to get them in there. But don't we want quality over quantity?
Yeah, one of the things that I did at the Palm Springs Police Department, I was in charge of recruiting and hiring as one of my positions. And as Tim mentioned, and everyone mentioned, that, and when I got hired on, for example, I had a high school diploma. I went on and got my master's degree. And it's about the culture of the agency that you're in and how they promote that. Getting in initially, when you're trying to replenish your police department and you're short, you need officers. At one time, for example, Palm Springs had a requirement that you had to have an associate's degree. They couldn't get anybody, they couldn't hire enough people because a lot of folks didn't have associate's degrees. So they lowered that down to, I think, 60 units, and then it went back down to high school diploma. But the culture at your particular agency, and that's what we as community members can ask about, is how many, after the police officers have become police officers, have gone on to get advanced degrees, AAs. And I would imagine that you will see quite a few agencies have that now. But initially, recruiting, high school diploma is how you're going to get those officers in the door. And once you get them in the door, it's up to the agency, to the city, to make sure that they're advancing in their education, both at the college level and institutional level.
we're gonna let Mr. White close us out because I saw he had a comment to make. So last comment is yours, Mr. White, and then we're gonna close out, and we'll be with you shortly to let you know when the next discussion will take place. But Mr. White, by all means, floor is yours.
Oh, hey, just wanted to say thanks for having this forum. It's important. I think somebody touched on it earlier as far as the worst thing that we can do in a situation like this is pretend the situation doesn't exist. So I appreciate the forum. I appreciate the dialogue. I appreciate the different viewpoints that sometimes that we have. And hey, I just appreciate it. Look forward to continued dialogue. I haven't really checked the chat, so I'm not sure what kind of questions that came up. Unfortunately, I'm here way over in Washington, D.C., and I can't be boots on ground. But any way that I can help from the East Coast, you got it. Anything that you need from me, and just appreciate you being here, and looking forward to the next get together.
Listen, we thank you all for your time and your expertise and for giving back. And we thank everyone who watched and who viewed and who commented and interacted. This will stay on Facebook. You can share it from wherever. You can also email and request a copy of the Zoom recording. We just want to do this to create a dialogue so we can build. We don't want America to look like America it is now, 10 years from now. We want to do something to help create a better atmosphere for all of us. So thank you all for your service and your time. And yes, we'll see you all next time. God bless everybody.
Just want to tell you guys again, thank you for giving your time. Really means a lot to us.
Take care, Charlie, man. Keep doing what you're doing out there.
All right. Thanks, bro.
Take care, fellas.
Signing off, everybody.